Could the pride of European knights resist a power that had already subdued half of the world? In Duthi-so-Karagit, western Poland, the greatest war machine ever created by mankind was preparing for a deadly clash with the finest of European aristocracy. What would take place during the next 3 days would destroy the legend of Europe's invincibility and leave a wound in the memory of Christendom that would not heal for centuries. The Mongols had arrived. To comprehend the magnitude of this disaster, we must first understand who the Mongols truly were. They were not the wild horde that European chroniclers would later depict them as. They were the heirs of Genghis Khan's revolutionary military organization, a force that, within 2 generations, had conquered lands stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the very edges of Europe. Every Mongol learned to ride a horse before he could even walk. He could shoot an arrow with deadly precision while galloping at full speed. He could live for weeks on mare's milk and dried meat, crossing distances that European soldiers considered impossible. By the year 1241, the Mongol Empire stretched from China to the very threshold of Europe. The great cities of Central Asia had already fallen. The strongest states of the Islamic world had been crushed. The Great Wall of China, once believed to be unbreakable, had proven useless. Now, under the leadership of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself, 30,000 of the most disciplined warriors in the world had already destroyed Kiev, the Pearl of Rus, and swept through Hungary like a storm through a field of wheat. The Mongol invasion of Europe was not a random outbreak of violence. It was a carefully planned and coordinated campaign of conquest. Batu divided his army. One force ravaged Hungary, while the other moved through Poland, systematically annihilating every force that could endanger the Mongol flank. They had already burned Lublin, plundered Sandomierz, and left Krakow in smoking ruins. Now their attention turned to Silesia, one of Poland's richest regions. Prince Henry II of Silesia, known as Henry the Pious for his devotion, understood exactly what awaited him. He was not a simple man. From the east came desperate messages, each one more horrifying than the last. Whole cities were reduced to ashes in days, populations slaughtered to the last child, armies that had stood for generations destroyed within hours. The reports spoke of horsemen like demons who fought with supernatural unity, appearing from nowhere and vanishing into thin air. But Henry was not a coward. He was an experienced leader who had fought in many campaigns. More importantly, he realized that if the Mongols were not stopped here, the rest of Europe would be left defenseless. He sent urgent appeals throughout Poland, Moravia, and the German lands. The answer was extraordinary. The Knights Templar, the legendary warrior monks of the Crusades, responded to his call. The Teutonic Knights, fresh from their campaigns in the Baltic, rode south with their heavy cavalry. Polish nobles across the divided kingdom, setting aside their quarrels, gathered their banners. Prince Mieszko brought all his men. Moravian infantry advanced north, and even miners from the rich Silesian mines, men who had never held a sword, volunteered to defend Christendom. Chroniclers of that time, writing with trembling hands, claimed that 100,000 men were ready to face the Mongol onslaught. This was almost certainly an exaggeration born from fear and hope. Modern historians, studying logistics and population data, believe the true number was closer to 20 or 25,000. But even that made it one of the largest European armies of the medieval period. For comparison, William the Conqueror had taken England with about 10,000 men. The biggest armies of the Third Crusade barely surpassed 30,000. Against them stood around 20,000 Mongols, 2 Tumans under Baidar and Khadan. The Europeans had greater numbers, heavier armor, and the finest metallurgy of their time. They had the Pope's blessing, they had faith that God was on their side, and they would soon learn that even this would not be enough. The Mongol leaders Baidar and Khadan were not the barbarians of European imagination, but brilliant military minds trained from early childhood in the art of war. Baidar was the grandson of Genghis Khan, raised in the customs of the great conqueror. Khadan was the son of Ogedai, the great Khan himself. These men were not simple raiders but commanders who had studied European tactics for many years through their intelligence network. Yes, the Mongols had spies all across Europe, often posing as traitors. They knew exactly how European armies fought. A mounted knight was the tank of the Middle Ages, hundreds of kilograms of man, armor, and horse combined into one devastating charge capable of breaking any infantry line. But the Mongols also understood their flaws. The knights were slow. Their horses quickly became exhausted under such weight. They fought for personal glory, often leaving formation to duel. And most of all, European warfare relied on close combat, while Mongol strategy focused on destroying the enemy from a distance before he could strike back. The first day, the European army advanced in its traditional formation, a spectacle that could stir any medieval heart. In the center rode the heavy cavalry, knights in chainmail and early plate armor. Their helmets shone in the sunlight, their lances raised proudly. Each knight's armor cost as much as a village could earn in an entire year. Their massive war horses snorted and pawed the ground, eager for battle. On both flanks marched the infantry, Polish spearmen, Moravian crossbowmen, and miners armed with makeshift weapons. They sang hymns, their voices echoing through the ranks. Priests moved among them, blessing the soldiers and granting forgiveness for their sins. The banners flew, the black cross of the Teutonic Knights, the red cross of the Templars, the white eagle of Poland. It was a magnificent sight, the united strength of Eastern European Christianity. Then a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Not the heavy dust of marching troops, but something lighter, faster, and strangely uneven. Out of it emerged the first Mongol riders, appearing like spirits, light cavalry mounted on small, tough horses, which looked like ponies compared to European war horses. The knights laughed. Were these the terrible Mongols? These short men on their little horses? It seemed that one charge would be enough to sweep them away. The Mongol riders came closer, reaching the distance from which they could shoot, but not the distance familiar to Europeans. Their composite bows, made of horn, sinew, and wood, could send arrows accurately up to 350 meters, far beyond the reach of any European crossbow. The horsemen released their arrows, sending them arching high into the sky, and then turned their mounts and rode away. "Cowards!" shouted the Polish knights. "They run like hares, like women." But that retreat was exactly what the Mongols intended. It was not cowardice, it was a deliberate tactic. For hours, wave after wave of mounted archers struck the European lines. They galloped forward, fired, and withdrew before the heavy cavalry could react. Each warrior carried 60 arrows in his quiver, with hundreds more loaded on pack horses. 20,000 men multiplied by 60 arrows, over 1 million projectiles. The arithmetic of death. The Europeans lifted their shields and endured, but the psychological impact was overwhelming. Knights had been trained for glorious attacks where steel rang in noble duels. Instead, they stood motionless like targets while unseen enemies drained their strength from afar. Horses screamed as arrows pierced gaps in their armor. Men cursed as shafts struck through their mail at the joints. The infantry, less protected, suffered even more. Prince Henry ordered his crossbowmen to fire back, but it was useless. By the time they reloaded and aimed, the Mongols were already far beyond reach. The Templar Knights asked for permission to charge. Henry refused. He knew that this was exactly what the Mongols wanted, to pull his troops apart and destroy them separately. But standing still while being slowly shot at was breaking his men's morale. As the sun began to set, the real horror of the Mongol warfare became clear. This would not be a glorious fight but a calculated massacre. By nightfall, hundreds of Europeans were dead or wounded, pierced with arrows in their arms, legs, and faces. Wounded horses had to be killed. The cries of pain filled the camp. The Mongols lost barely a dozen men, mostly from accidental crossbow shots. They made camp not far away, their signal fires glowing like stars fallen to the ground. Throughout the night, Mongol drummers beat their war drums, keeping the Europeans awake and exhausting their nerves. The second day came. The sunrise was blood-red, a sign even the priests could hardly explain. The European army, worn out by a sleepless night, lined up again. Many of the wounded had died during the darkness, and discipline was collapsing. Arguments about tactics broke out between Polish nobles and Templar commanders. The Teutonic Knights demanded an immediate attack. Prince Mieszko Opolski threatened to withdraw his men if they kept standing still and dying like cattle. Henry realized he must take action. When the Mongol horsemen appeared again at dawn, using the same exhausting tactics, he made a decisive choice. He commanded Prince Mieszko to lead a partial cavalry assault. Not with all troops, but with enough to push back the mounted archers and maybe capture prisoners for questioning. 2,000 of Poland's finest knights charged forward. The earth trembled under the weight of their advance. Spears pointed down, shields lifted high. It was an avalanche of steel and flesh. The Mongol light cavalry, seemingly frightened by the sight, turned and fled. The Europeans, burning with revenge after the humiliation of the previous day, gave chase. "They are ours," shouted Mieszko. "Forward, in Christ's name, kill them all." The pursuit went on for many kilometers. The European horses, burdened by their armored riders, began to tire. But the Mongols stayed just ahead, turning at times to shoot a few arrows, forcing the knights to press harder. Some Polish nobles began to sense a trap, but the rest, carried away by battle rage, rode on. It was precisely what the Mongols had planned, a false retreat, their most famous tactic, perfected over years of war. When the Polish cavalry stretched for miles, its formation completely broken, the trap closed with deadly precision. The Mongol heavy cavalry, yes, the Mongols also had heavy horsemen, something the Europeans never expected, appeared. They burst out from behind the hills. Units of light cavalry that had been circling unseen now moved in and closed the ring from every side. Prince Mieszko saw his fatal mistake, but it was already too late. His detachment was surrounded, cut off from the main army, trapped on the open steppe where European knights had no advantage. What followed was not a battle but a deliberate extermination. The Mongols did not fight in heroic hand-to-hand combat. They circled around the surrounded Europeans like wolves around trapped sheep, showering them with endless volleys of arrows. When the knights tried to break through, they were driven back by coordinated attacks. When they stayed still, they were shot down without mercy. The Mongol heavy cavalry charged only when the enemy was already weakened and disorganized. Prince Mieszko fought bravely. It is said he personally killed a dozen Mongols before 5 arrows brought him down from his horse. His bodyguards made a last stand around his fallen leader, singing their death songs, but they were overwhelmed. Out of 2,000 knights who had charged that morning, fewer than 200 returned to Henry's camp. The survivors were broken and terrified. Some soldiers lost their sanity from what they had witnessed. They spoke of devils who fought with unnatural precision, who seemed to communicate without words, who killed without pity or honor. One knight, whose armor had been pierced by 7 arrows, died murmuring, "These are not men, these are not human beings." That night, the Mongols sent a grim message to Henry's camp. The severed head of Prince Mieszko, preserved in salt, accompanied by a brief note written in clumsy Latin. "Tomorrow it will be your turn." The third day came, the day of destruction. Henry's war council that morning was a scene of barely restrained terror. He had already lost nearly a quarter of his army. The Moravian infantry was on the edge of desertion. Several Polish nobles had escaped during the night with their retinues. But Henry knew that retreat was impossible. The Mongols would overtake them in the open fields. The only option left was to stand and fight, to make one final desperate stand. Henry carefully selected the battlefield near the village of Legnica. There was a small rise that gave an advantage to his archers and a stream on one flank that was meant to prevent an encirclement. He arranged his troops in a defensive formation. The Templar and Teutonic knights held the center. These warrior monks would not retreat. The Polish cavalry took the right flank, and the remaining infantry occupied the left. Henry personally commanded the reserves. When the morning mist lifted, the Mongols appeared, but something was strange. They were not moving in their usual smooth formations. Instead, they seemed to be assembling strange objects, large pots or cauldrons mounted on wheels. The Europeans watched in confusion, thinking these were cooking vessels, perhaps pagans preparing some ritual. Then the battle began, and the true horror of Mongol ingenuity was revealed. The devices were Chinese gunpowder machines, not cannons, which were still decades away, but smoke projectors. The Mongols had learned this technology during their conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China. As the European line advanced, the Mongols ignited the devices, releasing immense clouds of thick, suffocating smoke that drifted over the field. Within minutes, the carefully organized European formation began to fall apart. Men could not see more than a few steps ahead. No commands could be heard over the coughing and chaos. Units lost contact with one another. The banners and medieval systems of coordination vanished in the haze. Knights crashed into their own infantry. Horses, terrified by the smoke, became uncontrollable. Then came a psychological masterstroke. A few days earlier, the Mongols had taken Polish captives and forced them to learn a single phrase in Polish: "Run, everything is lost." Now, amid the thick smoke and confusion, Mongol warriors who had memorized these words shouted them across the battlefield. The Polish soldiers, unable to see through the haze and hearing what they believed were their own countrymen's voices, thought their commanders had ordered a retreat. Panic spread like wildfire. Men began to run, colliding with those who still tried to hold their ground. The infantry on the left flank broke first, fleeing in disorder from the field. This left the center exposed, where the Templars and Teutonic knights still held their positions. But now they stood as isolated islands in a sea of chaos. The Mongols attacked with flawless coordination. How they managed to keep order within the smoke remains unknown to this day. Perhaps they used drums or horns tuned to frequencies that could cut through the confusion. Or perhaps they had simply practiced these maneuvers so many times that every unit knew its task instinctively. The light cavalry struck from the sides, showering arrows into the scattered masses. The heavy cavalry smashed into the broken formations, completely annihilating them. The Knights Templar fought with the bravery of men who believed they had earned martyrdom. Outnumbered and unable to see their foes until they were almost upon them, they formed a defensive ring and fought until none remained alive. Their Grand Master, Hans Dabin, was discovered after the battle with 23 arrows in his body. With a shattered sword and surrounded by fallen Mongols, the Teutonic Knights attempted to break out, forming a wedge and charging blindly through the smoke. They did manage to pierce the Mongol lines but found themselves on open ground, chased by the Mongol horsemen. They were hunted down one by one. Their heavy armor turned into a deadly trap as their exhausted horses collapsed. Prince Henry, watching his army fall apart, made the fatal decision to try to regroup his men. He rode forward carrying his personal banner, attempting to form a rallying point. For a brief moment it seemed to succeed. The Polish knights began to gather around him. Then a Mongol arrow, shot by an unknown archer, struck him under the arm where the metal plates of his armor met. He swayed in the saddle but remained on his horse, trying to keep fighting. His bodyguards surrounded him, attempting to pull him back from danger. The battlefield was chaos, yet the Mongols identified him as the leader. They focused all their efforts on this small cluster. Henry's guards fell one after another. At last Henry himself, weakened by loss of blood, slipped from his horse. When the soldiers saw their prince fall, the final organized resistance collapsed. The battle turned into a rout and then into a slaughter. The Mongols pursued the fleeing Europeans for kilometers, cutting them down as they ran. Armored knights threw off their armor to run faster. Proud nobles pleaded for mercy in tongues the Mongols either could not or would not understand. Prince Henry, still breathing but fatally wounded, was taken captive. The Mongol leaders, following their custom of honoring courageous foes, offered him a swift death. He refused, declaring that he would die as he had lived, as a Christian knight. The Mongols fulfilled his wish, severing his head and placing it upon a spear. Later they carried it through the conquered city as proof of victory. His mother, searching the field a few days later, could identify his body only by a single sign. He had 6 toes on his left foot. By midday that day, everything was finished. The magnitude of the disaster was beyond comprehension. Following their tradition, the Mongols cut off the right ear of every fallen enemy to count the dead. They filled 9 huge leather sacks, Chroniclers of the time wrote of between 10 and 25,000 European dead. Nearly the entire Silesian nobility was annihilated. The Templars and Teutonic Knights lost so many brothers that decades were needed to restore their orders. Whole noble families that had ruled for centuries disappeared in one morning. According to modern historians, Mongol losses numbered fewer than 700 men, most from the heavy cavalry used in the last assaults. The battlefield itself became a vision of hell. Bodies were piled so densely that in some areas a person could walk hundreds of meters without touching the soil. Flocks of carrion birds darkened the sky. The stench of death spread for kilometers. Local farmers continued to uncover bones in their fields for many decades afterward. In only 3 days, the smaller Mongol army had completely annihilated one of the largest European forces ever gathered. But the Battle of Legnica was more than a military loss. It was a psychological disaster that shattered Europe's confidence and changed the flow of history. The news of the defeat spread through Europe like a raging fire. In Paris, King Louis I immediately began reinforcing the city walls and training his soldiers in new methods of warfare. In Rome, Pope Gregory IX called for a new crusade, not to the Holy Land, but to defend Europe itself from these infernal horsemen. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, occupied with his ongoing conflict with the papacy, suddenly found both sides willing to discuss peace in the face of this external danger. Letters from that time reveal the depth of European fear. One German chronicler wrote, "The Mongols are God's punishment for our sins. They fight not as men with courage and honor, but as demons with deceit and cruelty. Our knights, the greatest warriors of Christendom, were like helpless children before them." The psychological shock went far beyond the battlefield. The Mongols had shown that the entire foundation of European feudal military strength, the armored knight, was useless against a disciplined, strategically superior army. The elaborate codes of chivalry, personal heroism, and honor-bound dueling that had defined European warfare meant nothing against an opponent who fought only to win by any possible means. Fortunately for Europe, deliverance arrived from an unexpected event. 8 months after Legnica, the great Khan Ogidi died in Mongolia. By Mongol law, every member of the royal family was required to return home to choose a new great Khan. Batu Khan, angry but loyal to tradition, withdrew his troops from Europe. The Mongols never again advanced so deep into the continent. Political struggles in Mongolia, immense distances, and the later disintegration of the Mongol Empire slowly reduced the danger. But the lesson remained etched into European memory in fire and blood. The Battle of Legnica ignited a transformation in European military thought within a single generation. European armies began adopting coordinated tactics between different branches, improving their archery, and experimenting with early gunpowder devices. The age of the knight's absolute dominance on the battlefield began its long decline. Feudal levies would gradually give way to professional armies. Planning and discipline would outweigh individual bravery. Some historians claim that Legnica saved Europe by delivering its harsh lesson just in time. When the Ottoman Turks, inheritors of many Mongol military ideas, threatened Europe 2 centuries later, its armies were ready with coordinated tactics, gunpowder weapons, and trained soldiers. The Europe that faced the Ottomans was no longer the Europe that had faced the Mongols. The Mongols had left a message written in blood: adapt or perish. Today, the Battle of Legnica is remembered differently across nations. In Poland, it is both a national tragedy and a symbol of pride. Their forefathers had stood against overwhelming odds to defend Christian Europe. In Mongolia, it is honored as one of history's greatest tactical triumphs. In military schools around the world, it is still studied as a flawless demonstration of how superior strategy and discipline can defeat greater numbers and advanced technology. The battlefield itself is now quiet farmland. A small monument marks the spot where Prince Henry is believed to have fallen. Each year, reenactors gather there to commemorate the anniversary of the battle. But no reenactment can truly capture the horror of that smoke-filled dawn when the medieval world order collapsed on the plains of Silesia. The echo of those Mongol hoofbeats still resonates through the centuries. They remind us that no empire, however mighty, no system, however ancient, is safe from sudden and devastating change. At Legnica, the Mongols did more than destroy an army. They shattered a worldview, ended an entire age, and forced a civilization to adapt or disappear. In only 3 days,